Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, Allergan, and Teva Pharmaceutical are facing lawsuits in 45 U.S. states. They're seeking damages to compensate for higher spending related to addiction. Drug companies are being blamed for using deceptive marketing campaigns that misrepresented the risks of opioid use.
There's a responsibility here that we believe is clear with respect to public nuisance law in the state. These companies, we believe, made no effort when this process began 20 years ago to ensure that they were providing in a clear and informed way what the downside was to opioid analgesic.
Oklahoma has been one of the states hardest hit by the crisis. Deaths caused by opioid overdoses there have exceeded the national rate for years. In 2015, more than 326 million opioid pills were dispensed to Oklahoma residents. That's enough for every adult to have 110 pills. The state estimates it will cost up to $18 billion to tackle drug abuse through rehabilitation programs. But the companies have denied playing a role in the crisis. While they do market brand names like OxyContin, most say they don't promote generic opioids like fentanyl. They also say the ingredients used in the drugs were approved by health authorities. Teva Pharmaceutical agreed on Sunday to pay Oklahoma $85 million to settle the lawsuit. It did not admit wrongdoing. Purdue Pharma did the same in March, settling for $270 million to avoid trial. That leaves Johnson & Johnson to defend its case on Tuesday. But the pressure on Big Pharma to take responsibility is just beginning.
Well, let's get more on the story now with Nicolas Terry from Indianapolis. He's the Executive Director of Indiana University's Center for Law and Health. Welcome back to Money Talks, Nicolas. This trial, as we know, is being closely watched around the United States and I suspect around the world as well. Tell us a bit more about why this is so significant.
Well, it's the first trial, the first time that the facts will actually come out in front of not a jury this time, but a judge. And the exact evidence and how it maps to the claims by the Attorney General will come out for the very first time.
Yes, and we heard in that piece the Attorney General for Oklahoma really making the case against the drug companies, saying that they're directly responsible for the opioid crisis across the state. Do you agree? Do you think companies like Johnson & Johnson are directly responsible?
I think there is a pretty good case to be made on ethical or moral grounds that the pharmaceutical companies have a considerable degree of responsibility here. That doesn't necessarily translate into good legal claims. The claim that is being relied on in Oklahoma, public nuisance, is very broad. It's quite vague. Different states are going to come to different conclusions as to whether the sale of a product, such as a drug, could ever be, as a matter of law, a public nuisance.
And the drug companies, of course, argue that the people taking the drugs have to bear some of that responsibility. Would you agree with that contention?
I think so. The real question is, what should they be responsible for? As I'm sure you and your viewers are aware, the opioid prescription crisis in the United States has now morphed into a crisis involving synthetic opioids that are produced illegally outside of the country and imported into the United States. And while there is some argument that the original prescription opioids led people into these illegal drugs, actually holding the drug manufacturers liable for a lot of the deaths that are going on today is somewhat more problematic.
Yes, and we also heard in Lila's piece there that the drug makers Purdue and Teva, they essentially blinked before they went to trial by offering these huge settlements. Do you think Johnson & Johnson, in this case in Oklahoma, may regret that they didn't do that?
It'll be really interesting. I'm kind of surprised that they didn't settle, given what happened over the weekend with Teva settling. 70, $80 million to escape a public trial with cameras, I think, in the courtroom must be tempting at this stage. But I think they really are settling in and saying, no, we're going to fight this public nuisance claim. We think it's a weak claim, and we'll see how it goes. Even if they lose before this judge, it's going to go up on appeal. We already have another court in the United States, North Dakota, where a judge has already ruled as a matter of law that public nuisance cannot be used in a case like this. There's also what we call a causation problem. To what extent does the Attorney General have to prove that a particular person was pulled into addiction because of the actions of the pharmaceutical company? Or is it sufficient to sort of make that linkage, that causation case on a statistical basis?
Okay, and just quickly, Nicholas, obviously this is just the start of the trial, but irrespective of what happens, do you think drug makers and opioid makers particularly have already learned a lesson and will change some of their ways in this drug?
I have no evidence that pharmaceutical companies have ever changed the way they do business. We are seeing that in our country at the moment with the huge overcharging that takes place. And this is just another example of a very large industry benefiting from its extreme market power.
Okay, we'll see how this trial unfolds in Oklahoma. Nicolas Terry, it's always good to get your thoughts. Thank you.